When an officer sees an elderly woman collapse on her front porch and rushes to help, he thinks it's just a medical emergency, but when she clutches his sleeve and whispers 3 cryptic words, his blood runs cold. What follows is a story of resilience, mystery, and the pursuit of justice that uncovers secrets buried for decades. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for truth and justice, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The morning in Willow Creek was as serene as ever. The sun peeked through the canopy of trees lining the streets, casting golden rays on the neatly trimmed lawns of suburban homes. Officer John Miller eased his patrol car through the familiar neighborhood, his keen eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. This was his beat, a quiet area where the most pressing calls usually involved barking dogs or misplaced mail. As John approached a cul-de-sac, the tranquility of the scene shifted. From the corner of his eye, he noticed an elderly woman, her frail figure staggering toward the street. She was clutching a wooden railing for support, her gait unsteady. Her silver hair, usually impeccably combed, was disheveled, and her worn cardigan hung awkwardly on her shoulders. Something was wrong. Jane hit the brakes and stepped out of the car. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "Are you all right?" The woman, whom he recognized as Mrs. Evelyn Carter, one of the longtime residents of Willow Creek, didn't respond. Her lips moved soundlessly and her gaze was unfocused. Before she could take another step, her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the sidewalk. John sprinted toward her, his heart racing. Kneeling beside her, he gently shook her shoulder. "Mrs. Carter, can you hear me?" Evelyn, her eyelids fluttered open briefly, and she clutched at his sleeve with surprising strength, her voice barely above a whisper rasped. "They'll find me." "Who?" "Evelyn." "Who's going to find you?" Jane pressed, but her eyes rolled back and her hand fell limp. John quickly checked her pulse. It was faint but steady. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I need an ambulance at 3442 Willow Creek Avenue." Elderly female collapsed and unresponsive. As he waited for paramedics, John's attention was drawn to her hand. Clutched in her frail fingers was a crumpled piece of paper. Carefully he pried it loose, his brow furrowing as he read the hastily scrawled message. "If anything happens to me, the answers are in the box." A chill ran down John's spine. What box? What answers? Evelyn Carr wasn't the type to dramatize things. She lived alone, kept to herself, and was known for her quiet dignity. This note suggested something far more sinister. Minutes later, the wail of sirens echoed down the street. The ambulance pulled up, and 2 paramedics jumped out carrying the stretcher. John briefed them quickly as they worked to stabilize Evelyn. "Will she be all right?" he asked the paramedic. "Her pulse is weak, but she's stable for now. You should notify her next of kin if you can," the paramedic replied before the vehicle sped away toward Willow Creek General Hospital. John stood there for a moment, staring after the ambulance. Evelyn's collapse wasn't just a routine medical emergency. Something far more sinister was at play. Jane stood on Evelyn Carter's porch, the faint echo of sirens still lingering in his ears as the ambulance disappeared down the street. The stillness of the house seemed almost unnatural now, and a sense of unease settled over him. The crumpled note in his hand was a riddle that demanded an answer. He stood outside the house, his radio in hand. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I'm at the residence of an elderly woman who collapsed. The victim was transported to the hospital. I'm securing the property and investigating possible suspicious circumstances." The front door, slightly ajar, invited him in. As a patrol officer, he knew he needed to secure the property, especially given the circumstances of Evelyn's collapse. He pushed the door open carefully, announcing his presence to anyone who might be inside. "Willow Creek PD, is anyone here?" Silence. John stepped into the living room, his boots barely making the sound on the worn carpet. The house was tidy, almost too tidy. Everything felt staged, like a museum display. Frozen in time, framed photographs of Evelyn's family lined the walls, capturing decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. But his attention was drawn to the coffee table in the center of the room. There it was, a box, polished wood, sturdy and locked with a robust padlock. It sat there like it was waiting for him. The Only thing out of place in an otherwise ordinary room, this had to be the box Evelyn's note. Referenced John crouched beside it, running his hand over the smooth surface. The weight of the mystery hung heavy. The answers are in the box. But what answers, and why would Evelyn write such a cryptic message? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe. He turned to see Clara, Evelyn's neighbor, peeking in hesitantly. She held a laundry basket and looked as though she was debating whether or not to enter. Officer Miller, she asked softly. I saw the ambulance earlier. Is Evelyn okay? She's stable, but she's been taken to the hospital, John said, rising to meet her. I'm just making sure her home is secure. Clara nodded, her expression clouded with concern. She's been acting strange lately. I thought it was just old age, but now I don't know. What do you mean by strange? John prompted. She kept talking about someone watching her, Clara said, shifting her weight nervously. She had new locks installed on the doors last week. I even saw her checking the windows at night. I told her she was just imagining things, but she seemed so convinced. John's brow furrowed. Did she mention anyone specific? Someone she thought might be watching her? Clara shook her head. No, but a few nights ago, I noticed a car parked across the street late at night. It wasn't anyone from the neighborhood I know. Everyone here, the car left when I turned on my porch light. But it was strange. John's gut tightened. What kind of car? Dark. Sid and Clara replied. I couldn't see the license plate. Thank you for telling me, John said, his voice firm but reassuring. If you notice anything else unusual, let me know immediately. Clara hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking toward the box on the coffee table. What's that? John glanced at it. Not sure yet, but I think it's important. Clara nodded slowly, her concern evident. Please keep her safe, officer. Evelyn's a good woman. She doesn't deserve whatever this is. I'll do my best, Jan assured her. As Clara left, Jan turned back to the box. The house felt emptier now, but the box seemed heavier, its presence almost demanding his attention. He couldn't force it open. Not here, not now. But it was clear that whatever was inside might explain everything. Carefully, he lifted the box, surprised by its weight. As he carried it out to his patrol car, he scanned the street. One last time, his senses heightened. The quiet neighborhood now felt charged with unease. Placing the box securely in the trunk, John climbed into the driver's seat. He picked up his radio and called his partner, Detective Lisa Hayes. Lisa, it's John, he said, keeping his voice steady. We got something unusual. I'm bringing it to the precinct. What kind of unusual? Lisa asked. A locked box and a cryptic note, John replied. I'll fill you in when I get there. Got it. See you soon, Lisa said as John started the car and pulled away from Evelyn's house. His thoughts churned. What was Evelyn so afraid of? Who was watching her? And what would he find inside that box? Share your thoughts below and give this video a like if this story has piqued your interest, and keep watching to find out. At the precinct, Officer John Miller carried the locked box into Detective Lisa Hayes' office. Lisa, a Sharpie investigator with a knack for spotting connections others missed, had already pulled Evelyn Carter's file. Did you find anything unusual at the house? Lisa asked, gesturing for John to set the box on her desk. John hesitated before speaking. Her house was undisturbed, but this box was front and center in her living room. It was locked, but she had a note clutched in her hand saying the answers were inside. Something about all this feels deliberate. Lisa nodded, her expression growing more serious. We just got an update from the hospital. Evelyn's condition is critical. Doctors believe she's been poisoned over time, possibly weeks. They're running tests to confirm. She paused, watching John's reaction. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted her silence. John felt a chill run through him. She said something before she collapsed. They'll find me. I thought she might have been paranoid, but now it looks like she was right. Lisa finished opening her laptop and pulling up Evelyn's sparse records. We need to figure out who would want to harm an elderly widow living alone. A thought struck John. Let's visit the hospital. If she wakes up, she might be able to tell us more. Lisa agreed, and the two officers headed to Willow Creek General. In Evelyn's dimly lit hospital room, the rhythmic beep of machines filled the air. Evelyn lay frail and pale against the crisp white sheets, an oxygen mask obscuring most of her face. A nurse informed him that she had been in and out of consciousness but was stable for now as John and Lisa approached her. Bedside Evelyn's eyelids fluttered open. She struggled to focus on John, her lips moving faintly beneath the mask. Mrs. Carter, Jane said softly, leaning closer. "It's Officer Miller, you're safe now." Her fingers twitched, reaching weakly for his hand. John grasped it gently, leaning in to hear her faint whisper. "The box," she murmured. Her voice was almost inaudible, but the urgency in her tone was unmistakable. "It's all in the box." Lisa stepped closer, her notepad ready. "Evelyn, who's trying to hurt you? Can you tell us anything about what's in the box?" Evelyn's lips parted, but a coughing fit racked her body, and the nurse stepped in to adjust her oxygen mask. "She needs rest," the nurse said firmly. "You can try again later." Lisa and Jane exchanged a glance, understanding that Evelyn's time to share the truth might be running out. Back at the precinct, the box sat ominously on Lisa's desk. With a determined look, she retrieved a set of lock-picking tools from her drawer and began working on the lock. After a few tense minutes, the latch clicked open, and the box revealed its contents. Inside were meticulously organized items: yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and a weathered leather-bound journal. Lisa and John began examining the items one by one. "Look at this," Lisa said, holding up a black and white photograph of a much younger Evelyn standing beside a distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit. Scribbled on the back were the words "Evelyn and Henry Blake, 1967. Who's Henry Blake?" John asked. Flipping through the clippings, Lisa frowned as she skimmed through one article. "He was a businessman, high profile back in the 60s and 70s, owned several companies in construction and real estate. According to this, he disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1980. John glanced at the journal, flipping it open to the first page. The entries were written in Evelyn's careful script, starting decades ago. Most were mundane reflections on her life, but as the pages progressed, the tone shifted. Words like secrets, betrayal, and danger were scattered throughout. Lisa pointed to an entry dated a few months ago. "Listen to this. I can't stop thinking about what I found. It wasn't an accident. If I don't speak up, it will stay buried forever. But if I do," Lisa's voice trailed off, her brows furrowing. John turned a few more pages, stopping at the last entry, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. It read, "The truth is closer than ever. I must tell someone before they silence me." Lisa tapped her pen against her notepad. "If Evelyn's right, she stumbled onto something big enough to get her targeted, and Henry Blake, with his sudden disappearance, might be the key." John stared at the open journal, his gut telling him this was only the beginning. "If someone's willing to poison her to keep her quiet, we need to figure out what she uncovered fast." Lisa tapped her pen against the desk, murmuring aloud, "Why didn't she come forward sooner?" Meanwhile, Officer John Miller returned to Evelyn's neighborhood, his mind replaying her cryptic warning. "They'll find me." The morning sun had risen higher, bathing Willow Creek in an uncharacteristic unease. John parked his cruiser in front of Evelyn's house and approached Clara, the elderly neighbor who had shared her concerns earlier. Clara was watering her flower beds when John arrived. She looked up, her face creased with worry. "Officer Miller, did you find out what's wrong with Evelyn?" "She's in the hospital," John replied, his tone cautious, "but I need your help. Did you notice anything unusual around here in the past few weeks? Any visitors or anyone who didn't belong?" Clara hesitated, clutching the watering can tighter. "Well, there was a man I didn't think much of it at first, but he's been around a few times. I thought maybe he was a relative. But she never mentioned anyone. He'd sit there for hours, and if anyone got too close, he'd drive off." "Did you get a look at him?" Clara shook her head. "He stayed in the car. Mostly. I only caught a glimpse once. A man in his 40s or 50s. I guess he wore sunglasses and a baseball cap. Seemed off." John nodded, thanking Clara, before heading back to his patrol car. As he sat in the driver's seat scanning the area, something caught his attention: a black sedan parked 2 houses down, partially obscured by an overgrown hedge. His pulse quickened. Was this the same car Clara had mentioned? He stepped out of his vehicle, keeping his movements measured. The sedan's engine was idling faintly, and the driver's silhouette was just visible behind the tinted windows. John approached cautiously, his hand instinctively hovering near his sidearm, before he could get too close, the driver must have noticed him. The car's engine roared, and the sedan lurched forward, speeding down the quiet street. John sprinted back to his cruiser, radioing dispatch as he gave chase. "This is Officer Miller," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I have a suspicious vehicle fleeing the scene near 340 Willow Creek Avenue. Black sedan, tinted windows, heading east toward Main Street." The sedan weaved through the suburban streets with alarming precision, its driver clearly familiar with the area. John pushed his cruiser harder, the sirens wailing as he tried to close the gap, but as they reached a busier intersection, the sedan cut sharply onto a side street and disappeared into an alley too narrow for John's car to follow. He slammed the steering wheel in frustration, radioing an update to dispatch: "Suspect vehicle lost near Oak and 3rd, requesting units to sweep the area." John parked and stepped out, inspecting the tire marks left behind where the sedan had peeled away. They were fresh, confirming Clara's claim about the car's repeated presence near Evelyn's home. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just watching Evelyn, he was willing to risk exposure to stay close. At the precinct, Lisa leaned back in her chair, piecing together the journal entries. The dates lined up with an old embezzlement scandal that had rocked the city decades ago. Henry Blake, Evelyn's husband, had been accused of laundering millions through a network of shell companies. The scandal had made headlines for weeks, but Blake's sudden disappearance left the case unresolved. Authorities suspected foul play, but no evidence ever surfaced. Lisa tapped a particular entry dated just weeks early. "Clear. I found it, the proof they never wanted me to have. I can't let it die with me. That's it," Lisa muttered, grabbing her phone to call John. Evelyn had proof of Henry's crimes, or maybe someone else's involvement. She kept it hidden all these years. John answered on the second ring, his voice clipped. "I just chased down a black sedan that's been stalking Evelyn's house. Driver got away, but it's clear someone's keeping tabs on her." Lisa's grip on the phone tightened. "We need to connect this to the journal." Evelyn's scared because she uncovered something that could ruin someone, maybe more than one person. And if Henry Blake disappeared because of it, whoever is watching her might think she has the same fate coming. Then we don't have much time," John said grimly. "I'll head back to the precinct." Back at the precinct, John and Lisa sat across from one another, the weight of Evelyn Carter's journal heavy on their minds. The cryptic entries painted a picture of fear, betrayal, and a secret that had been buried for decades. Each line was a puzzle piece, and they worked together to fit them into a cohesive whole. Lisa tapped her pen on a specific line in the journal. "Look at this one. The truth is buried where love never dies. It has to mean something." John leaned over the desk, frowning. "It's poetic, but it's not exactly a roadmap." "You think it's symbolic or literal?" Lisa shrugged, her expression thoughtful. Considering Evelyn's condition, she wouldn't waste time being cryptic if it didn't matter. "What if it's tied to Henry Blake? She mentioned him so often in this journal." John considered the name Henry Blake's grave if she's referring to him. And love never dying, it could mean something is hidden there. Lisa nodded, her excitement growing. "It's worth checking out. If Evelyn suspected foul play in his disappearance, she might have buried the truth where she thought no one would look." The two detectives quickly obtained the necessary permissions to investigate Henry Blake's grave. It wasn't easy convincing the city to approve an exhumation, but Evelyn's critical condition and the evidence in the journal made a strong case. By mid-afternoon, they stood in the quiet expanse of Willow Creek Cemetery, the air thick with tension, the grave marked by an ornate headstone etched with "beloved husband" and "vision." AR had an air of peaceful permanence, but beneath the surface, secrets lay buried. The exam team worked methodically, carefully removing soil as John and Lisa watched from a few steps away. Janan scanned the cemetery, his instincts heightened by the recent chase with the black sedan. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching them even now. Lisa's voice broke his concentration. "We're almost there." Moments later, a rusted metal box was unearthed, lying just beneath the headstone. Its edges were corroded, and the latch had long since fused with age, but the weight of its contents was Unmistakable Jan stepped forward, donning gloves, as he carefully lifted the box. "This is it. Let's get it back to the precinct." Back at the station, the box was opened under controlled conditions. Inside, they found a treasure trove of evidence, faded bank records detailing massive financial transactions, the names of shell companies, and a series of correspondences implicating high-profile individuals in a sprawling money laundering operation. Among the documents was a list of names that included politicians, business moguls, and law enforcement officials from decades ago. This is enough to destroy careers and legacies," Lisa murmured, flipping through the papers. John's jaw tightened. "It's not just about their careers. If this scheme ran as deep as it looks, there are people out there who'd kill to keep this buried." Evelyn was right to be scared. Lisa placed the documents back in the box. "We need to protect her. If someone's willing to stalk her over this, they won't stop." Now John's expression hardened. "I'll notify the hospital. We'll put a plain close officer on her door and increase patrols around the area." That evening, John visited the hospital, his protective instincts kicking in. As he approached Evelyn's room, she remained unconscious, her frail body connected to an array of monitors. A nurse stood nearby, charting her vitals. "Any changes?" Jan asked quietly. The nurse shook her head. "She's stable, but still critical. It's a waiting game now." Johan stepped closer to Evelyn's bedside, her face pale and sunken but peaceful in repose. He felt a pang of guilt. Had they acted sooner, could they have prevented her collapse? And now, with the evidence in their hands, they only increased the danger surrounding her. "You've been through so much," he murmured, "but I promise we'll make this right." Back at the precinct, Lisa worked late into the night, cataloging the documents from the box. Each new piece of information confirmed Evelyn's suspicions and painted a picture of systemic corruption that spanned decades. She felt a deep respect for the elderly woman who had carried the weight of such damning knowledge for so long. As Lisa filed away the last folder, her phone buzzed. It was John. "How's it going there?" he asked, overwhelming. She admitted, "This isn't just one crime, it's a web. And I'm starting to think Evelyn didn't just uncover it, she might have been a victim of it." "What do you mean?" Lisa sighed. Henry Blake disappeared because of what he knew. Evelyn must have known they'd come after her. Eventually, that note in the journal wasn't just about justice. It was her contingency plan in case they found her. First, there was a pause before John replied. "Then, we need to stay one step ahead. I'm not letting them get to her." Lisa smiled faintly despite the gravity of the situation. "That's why you're one of the good ones, John." The tension around Evelyn Carter's case grew palpable as Lisa worked late into the night, piecing together the connections between the names listed in the documents. One name in particular kept resurfacing: Gerald Roy. Known for his violent reputation and ties to organized crime, Roy had been an enforcer in Henry Blake's circle, a shadow figure who ensured loyalty through intimidation and brute force. "This guy is bad news," Lisa muttered to herself, scrolling through Royce's criminal record. Assault, racketeering, and suspected involvement in multiple disappearances filled his file, though he'd avoided prison due to lack of evidence. Roy's name had become synonymous with fear. Meanwhile, John continued his patrols, his thoughts frequently drifting to Evelyn's case. He couldn't shake the image of her frail form in that hospital bed, or the cryptic warning she'd muttered before collapsing. The pieces they had uncovered pointed to a dangerous network, one that wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats. As Jan drove through a quiet residential area, his radio silent for the first time. That evening, a black SUV appeared in his rearview mirror. It followed him for several blocks, its headlights a steady presence in the growing darkness. John's instincts flared. This wasn't just a coincidence. He pulled over, pretending to check his onboard computer. The SUV idled for a moment before parking across the street. John's hand hovered near his holstered weapon as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. The man's face was rough and weathered, his eyes cold and calculating. "Officer Miller," the man said casually as he approached, his voice low and grilly. "Nice night for a patrol." Johan stepped out of his car, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Can I help you?" The man smirked, his hands resting loosely his jacket pockets. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, digging into things that are better left buried." John's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Name's Royce," the man replied, his smirk widening. Let's just say I have a vested interest in keeping certain things quiet. John's pulse quickened, but he kept his tone steady. Are you here to make a point, Mr. Roy? Because threatening an officer isn't exactly a smart move. Roy chuckled a low, menacing sound. I'm not threatening you, officer, just giving some friendly advice. Walk away, you don't want to end up like Mrs. Carter. At that, John's hand moved instinctively to his holster. If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not working. You should leave. Ray's expression hardened, and he took a step closer, the tension between them thick. You've been warned. With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, driving off into the night. Jan immediately reported the encounter to Lisa, recounting Roy's veiled threat. He knows we on to him, John said, his jaw clenched, and he's trying to scare us off. Lisa frowned, her mind racing. Roy isn't just a thug, he's connected. If he's involved, it means we're getting close to something big, but it also means Evelyn's in more danger than ever. The two detectives agreed to double security at the hospital and assigned officers to discreetly monitor Evelyn's room. John insisted on personally overseeing her protection, his sense of responsibility growing with each new threat. The next morning, Evelyn's condition showed signs of improvement. Though still weak, she regained consciousness long enough to communicate with Jan and Lisa. Her eyes fluttered open, and she motioned weakly for John to come closer. Officer Miller, she rasped, her voice barely audible. The box, did you find it? John nodded, leaning in. We did. It's safe now. Can you tell us more about what's in it? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her frailty underscoring the weight of what she carried. It's everything Henry was involved in. And those men? John asked. Henry's former associates. They made Henry the scapegoat. And now they're coming for me. John's heart ached for the woman whose life had been overshadowed by fear. You've been incredibly brave, Evelyn, he said softly. We're going to make sure they pay for what they've done. Her trembling hand reached out to grasp his. Be careful, they don't care who they hurt. Back at the precinct, Lisa delved deeper into Roy's connections, her determination unwavering. Roy is the muscle that he's not the mastermind, she told Jan. There's someone higher up pulling the strings. Jan nodded grimly. Whoever it is, they're not going to stop until they're exposed, or until we're silenced. As the team worked tirelessly, another report came in. Roy had been spotted near the precinct earlier that evening. It was a chilling reminder that the danger wasn't just theoretical. Roy was watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The precinct was a hive of activity as Lisa and John orchestrated the sting operation, using the documents as bait. They leaked false information that the evidence was being transported to a secure forensic facility across town. Roy and his crew had been closely monitored for days, and the plan hinged on their desperate attempt to intercept the transport. We'll use an unmarked van, Lisa had explained during the briefing. It'll follow a route we know. Royce's crew can access. Surveillance teams will be stationed along the way, and we'll move in as soon as they take the bait. John nodded, his expression focused. They're desperate, and they've shown they're willing to take risks. This is our best shot to take them down. As night fell, the van prepared for departure. Inside, two undercover officers posed as transport personnel, with John and Lisa trailing close behind in separate vehicles. Surveillance units positioned themselves along the route, ready to respond at a moment's notice. The convoy began its journey through the dimly lit streets of Willow Creek, the tension palpable. Every corner, every shadow seemed to pulse with potential danger. Halfway through the route, a black SUV roared up behind the van, headlights flashing. The driver of the SUV swerved aggressively, forcing the van to slow. Two more vehicles joined in, boxing the van in on a deserted stretch of road. From his car, John's voice crackled over the comms. This is it, all you units hold position until I give the signal. The black SUV screeched to a halt, and Roy emerged, flanked by three men. He approached the van with a swagger, his weapon drawn. Get out, he barked. Nice and slow. The undercover officers complied, stepping out with their hands raised. Roy's men surrounded the van, yanking open the rear doors. Inside, they found the decoy evidence, a locked briefcase meant to mimic the real documents. Got it, Roy muttered, signaling his men to load the briefcase into their SUV. John watched from his position, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He waited until the crew was fully distracted before giving the order move in a coordinated assault, unfolded patrol. Cars and tactical units surged from all directions, their sirens piercing the night. Floodlights illuminated the scene. As officers surrounded the SUVs, "Freeze, drop your weapons," John's voice boomed as he emerged from his vehicle, his gun trained on Roy. Caught off guard, Roy hesitated for a split second before raising his weapon. John's instincts kicked in, and he fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the ground near Roy's feet.